Thank you, David. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. It's been a long time since this group got together, 11 years actually. So it's good that we can talk about all of these issues. And I like this discussion because we're getting the perspective from different laboratory systems. I'm here to talk about how we in the FBI laboratory handle and process trace evidence. Okay, here are the questions that will be addressed. I'm not going to go through these specifically right now because we're going to hit them through the course of the presentation, and I have very little time to get through all my slides. Okay, a little bit of history. Have to throw in a little bit of history. 75 years ago, actually this November, was when the Bureau of Investigation opened up its technical laboratory. And contrary to popular belief, Hal Dedman was not in that original laboratory. A couple other interesting things about it I won't go into. Here's a couple pictures of the original laboratory. Okay, you notice what's there in the middle? We've got microscopes. Okay, things haven't changed that much over the last 75 years. And I'll make an admission right now, that was my last picture. I apologize. This presentation doesn't really lend itself to pictures, but how have we evolved in the FBI laboratory? Trace evidence exams encompass at least 28 different people in the FBI laboratory. That's depending on how you define trace evidence. Does that include shoe prints, tire treads? Does it include arson, etc.? But we cover essentially areas of 4 different units. Trace evidence unit, the explosives unit, and it's not explosive documents, that's not a new thing we're doing, question documents, and chemistry. I seem to have a recurring theme, and my people will know this, of issues with PowerPoint and it doing very bad things to me. Okay, here, just so you have a perspective of my unit, trace evidence unit, I have 18 people, and that's actually gone down by about 25% over the last few months. We had a big cutback, but I've got 18 people dedicated to trace evidence. Of those, 14 are hair and fiber examiners. Okay, I'd be willing to bet nobody else in the world has that many people they can throw at just hair and fiber examiners in one building. And I have some very specialized people doing just mineralogy, 3 people to conduct soil, glass, building material examinations. We also have our chemistry unit. We have representatives here from our chemistry unit. I think it's 3 people, is that correct? Assigned solely to paint, tape, and polymer examinations. So we dedicate a lot of people to these specific examinations. A couple of numbers. Calendar year 2006, we received about 11,000 cases into the laboratory. Okay? Of those, about 4,000 came through the trace evidence unit. 4,000 cases. Now, added to our normal casework, we're getting a lot of evidence coming from across the pond, if you will. And I'm not going to go too in-depth into that, but you can probably figure out the types of cases that we are now getting. That's 1 out of 3 cases that come into our laboratory that will be subjected to trace evidence exams. As you can see, we take a very proactive approach, and we try to examine trace evidence whenever possible. Just by its nature, we will do our work first. Trying to see what I can cut out to go quickly. My position is not really the coordinator for the case. We've kind of switched the way we do things now. The trace evidence unit is solely working the actual cases. We have a whole other unit that is the evidence control unit. The evidence comes in, they assign the examiners who it's going to go to, they make initial contact with the contributor, and during that initial contact, there may be conversation with, like, do you want trace evidence? We don't really care what's on the submittal letter from our people or from state and local law enforcement agencies, because we're going to educate them and say, hey, we can do hair, we can do glass, we can do soil, we can do all these examinations. Do you want us to do that? And that's handled in that initial telephone call from our evidence control unit. Okay, how do we view it in the laboratory? I mean, we do these exams on most of the major cases. Here's a couple of them that you've certainly all heard of. Believe it or not, the anthrax letters, I've spent a good portion of my career, it seems, working on the fibers recovered from those anthrax letters. We've done a lot of work on those fibers. But trace evidence has played a role in all of these investigations. Okay, certainly in some high-profile violent crimes. A couple of the examiners that have worked some of these are here. And we're going to hear more about O.J. Simpson a little later on from Hal Dedman. The Washington, D.C. sniper case. We had trace evidence role in that case. The bottom line, we try to fully exploit trace evidence on every case where it's appropriate in the FBI laboratory. And then we dictate the flow of that evidence, obviously, on every case, most every case, in order to maximize all different types of evidence. For example, a bombing case, a hoax device or a real case, and this is what we're seeing a lot of nowadays. It'll come in, we'll do photography, we'll do maybe some super gluing if we need to immobilize latent prints, and it'll come to trace evidence. We'll take it apart, remove the tape, may take apart the device to some extent. It goes on for more latent prints. We'll do hair analysis, fiber analysis, comparisons if possible, mitochondrial DNA analysis, and so on, down to typically the very end. Chemistry unit will do their tape examinations. Okay, threat letter cases. This is something we didn't think about and did not exploit for a long time, but now we do. Since anthrax, the number of threat letter cases that we process has just skyrocketed. Traditionally, we didn't do anything with these threat letter cases. Now it comes in, we're looking underneath the stamp, we're looking underneath the flap, we're looking underneath the tape to see if there's anything present. Go on to question documents. It may come back at some point to trace evidence. As you can see down here, you can hardly see it because of the logo down here. But if we have a powder that's present, the mineralogy examiners will take a look at that powder and do their exams. Okay, more typical cases, knives will exploit the trace evidence, the DNA, latent prints. We may come back to that, revisit that knife later on for cut and tear examinations if we have a garment to compare it to. I covered this a little bit. We're actively involved in these devices coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. All right, the two case scenarios, the homicide case and the carjacking case. The types of evidence that we would be looking for, we would be processing, recovering first. Victim's clothing for trace evidence, hairs and fibers. Victim's clothing go on, DNA, latent prints, possibly depending on the nature of the clothing. The ligature, obviously trace evidence, hairs and fibers. You may be able to identify the manufacturer of that piece of cordage. Then, of course, on to DNA. Victim's rape kit, trace evidence, DNA, all this is pretty much common sense. The comparisons that we would be looking to do, the hairs. Okay, compare question hairs back to victims' knowns. The fibers, look for similar ligatures, maybe soil from the suspect's vehicle. Comparing common fibers between suspect and victim environments. Carjacking case, very, very similar type scenario that we would follow. Looking at the evidence from the vehicle, what's there? Process it for trace and evidence, whether it's vacuuming, tape lifting. We're somewhat subject to the mechanisms of the submitting agency, and we can't really dictate how they process that vehicle. But latent, certainly clothing items, trace evidence, DNA. Evidence from the suspects, clothing items, all pretty common sense. But we will spend the time and we will work the hairs, the fibers, the soil, the glass on all of these types of cases before it moves on to DNA. I made this point earlier. In that initial contact with the contributor by our evidence control unit, we will routinely ask them, do you want us to do trace for you, even though you didn't ask us for it? And sometimes, if we don't make contact with them and we don't get that buy-in or that agreement, we'll probably do it anyway. We're going to try and exploit it whenever possible. As far as management support, I'm very lucky. I heard earlier about management support as far as having trace evidence personnel in management positions. My section chief is a former trace evidence examiner. My deputy assistant director, who opened up the session, Melissa Smurs, is a former trace evidence examiner. And the assistant director of the laboratory division is a former trace evidence examiner. So I'm in a very lucky position right now in that I've got trace evidence, hair and fiber people all the way up my chain of command. That could change in the future, and I guess that'll be something we have to address when we get to that point. Past versus future applications, probably our biggest push was mitochondrial DNA analysis. And that's been talked about already. That came about in 1996. It actually started as part of the hair and fiber unit, which is what we were called back then. It was an initiative that we moved forward with, started the analyses, started the research, validated it, brought it online, and it was part of the trace evidence unit. Very quickly, it grew, blossomed, mushroomed into something very, very large, and now they have 24 people just doing mitochondrial DNA analysis. In addition, you've got representatives from 4 regional mitochondrial DNA laboratories sitting here in this audience. So it has gone from being a part of the hair and fiber unit to we now have regional labs throughout the country helping us out on these hair cases. Some of the other areas that they work in, traditional casework for mitochondrial DNA, missing persons cases, and then, as I mentioned, the regional mitochondrial DNA laboratories. Missy touched on a lot of these, but some of the things that are being worked on, and you're going to hear presentations on a lot of these. The pattern recognition software for MSP data, environmental effects of textile fibers, and the list goes on. If you want to talk about any of these things, you can come see me. I can direct you to the researchers who are probably in this room. But we need to do research. We need to expand our capabilities, because the jury is seeing that there is new technology out there. We need to be able to exploit it so we can maybe get past the could have. Well, can we put some more information on it than just could have? Maybe some of these techniques will allow us to do that. Relevance to the crime scene. This has been the subject kind of running through the talks today and actually yesterday. This is probably our single biggest problem area, is our relevance to the crime scene. Much like Stefan talked about earlier, they are very far removed from the actual crime scene. We're in the same boat as they are. So our contact with crime scene personnel is typically long after that crime scene has already been processed. So I would say that's probably one of our single biggest shortcomings, is we don't have that contact with the crime scene personnel. I'm going to skip through this. Okay, court system. And I know Woody's going to be talking more about the court system, but briefly, how often do we end up going and testifying? And I'll tell you that number has dropped dramatically over the last 10 years, even since I started. 2006, trace evidence examiners, and I believe this is just trace evidence units, so my hair and fiber and mineralogy people, testified 26 times, either in the US, federal, or state courts. Okay? That's not very many times. That's very different from where it was 10, even 15 years ago. Okay? A significant decrease in the utilization of trace evidence. Some of the other things that we're seeing, we often have probative, useful results, and we're not being asked to testify. Okay? Why? We're seeing an increase in the number of requests for negative testimonies. Why? I got a pretty good idea why that one is. Jeff talked about it earlier, and I won't mention that show either. But we'll have no probative results, no useful information, and yet the prosecutor feels the need to show that they've done everything they could to analyze and exploit the evidence in the case. So of those 26 testimonies, a fair percentage are of these. So why aren't we being used? There's some possible reasons. As we all know, DNA. Okay, if you have the identification, why bother with this stuff? That seems to be the perception. Okay, over-reliance on even mitochondrial DNA. We'll see the mitochondrial DNA examiners go out and talk about or testify to their results, and they don't send out or they don't ask for the microscopic hair examiner to go out and testify. We try and have our mitochondrial DNA examiners talk to the prosecutor and get them on board with, yes, you need to have the microscopic association represented by a testimony also. But we still have many cases where the mito examiner will testify without the hair and fiber examiner. Once we do get in the courtroom, and if we are talking about useful, probative, meaningful results, we don't typically see problems, even with Daubert issues. We've had, in the last 10 years, 4 Daubert hearings by hair and fiber examiners. 3 hairs, 1 fibers, and the evidence was admitted into court every single time. So it's not like we're getting into court and they're seeing that there's no scientific basis for our examinations. Just for some reason, they're not asking us to come to court in the first place. Okay, some of the directions that we're going, these have been talked about already. Databases, you're hearing these recurring themes from all the presenters here. Perfect time. Okay, and we'll have opportunity for more questions, I guess, afterwards. Thank you.